She stepped onto the auction platform, and the entire crowd fell silent. Men who had come to bargain, shout, and compete for labor suddenly forgot why they were there. Even the traders paused mid-sentence, staring at the woman standing beneath the hot Louisiana sun. Because in a place where human beings were treated like property, her beauty was so striking that it stopped the entire auction. Welcome to Shadow of Black History, the place where hidden truths, forgotten lives, and powerful untold stories finally come into the light. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the time there right now. We love seeing how far these stories travel across the world, and if you have not subscribed yet, please subscribe and like the channel, so you never miss the powerful stories we uncover here. We truly appreciate every one of you for being here today. The story you are about to hear comes from a rare account recorded in Louisiana in the year 1851. It describes a woman whose appearance stunned the crowd in a slave auction so completely that the entire market momentarily forgot its cruel business. But behind that moment of silence lay a deeper story of power, danger, and the harsh realities of life in the slave markets of the American South. So relax, remove every distraction around you, and pay close attention as we begin. The Louisiana slave markets during the early 1800s were among the busiest in the United States. The city of New Orleans in particular had become a central hub where enslaved people were bought and sold to plantation owners across the Mississippi Valley. Traders brought men, women, and children by boat, wagon, and forced marches from surrounding states. Buyers arrived from cotton and sugar plantations, looking for workers strong enough to endure the brutal labor that defined plantation life. The auctions followed a routine that repeated day after day. Enslaved people were brought onto wooden platforms where buyers inspected them carefully. Men were valued for strength and endurance in the fields. Women were often judged not only for their ability to work, but also for domestic labor, such as cooking, sewing, and caring for children. Buyers examined hands, teeth, and posture, discussing prices as if they were purchasing animals rather than human lives. On one particular morning in the year 1851, a trader brought a new group of enslaved people into the auction yard near the New Orleans waterfront. The air was already thick with humidity from the nearby Mississippi River. Buyers gathered beneath the shade of wooden awnings while traders shouted prices and argued over bids. Wagons rattled through the nearby streets carrying cotton and sugar destined for ships waiting along the docks. The auction moved quickly. Several men were sold within minutes, their strength making them valuable to plantation owners preparing for another harvest season. Then the trader called for the next person. A young woman was led onto the platform. At first, the crowd reacted the same way it did for any other sale. But then something unusual happened. The noise of the market began to fade. Buyers who had been shouting moments earlier suddenly grew quiet. A few men stepped closer to the platform, their expressions shifting from casual interest to open astonishment. The woman standing before them was unlike anyone they expected to see in that place. Witnesses who later wrote about the event described her as possessing extraordinary beauty. Her posture was calm, despite the humiliating situation, and the sunlight reflected across her face in a way that made the crowd pause. For a brief moment, the cruel routine of the auction seemed to stop. Even the trader who had brought her to the platform appeared aware that something unusual was happening. He cleared his throat and raised his voice, trying to restart the bidding. "Strong and healthy," the trader announced loudly, "capable of housework and field labor." But the buyers were not listening to the usual sales pitch. They were staring at her. Some men whispered to one another. Others adjusted their hats and stepped forward, as if trying to see her more clearly. The silence that had fallen over the yard was strange for a place normally filled with loud arguments and fast bargaining. The trader recognized the opportunity immediately. Beauty, like strength, could raise the price in the slave market. He began describing the woman in glowing terms, emphasizing not only her health, but also her appearance. His voice grew louder and more dramatic as he encouraged the crowd to compete for ownership. The bidding finally began. At first, the offers came slowly. Then another buyer raised the price. Another followed. Within minutes, the numbers climbed higher than what most women at the market usually brought. The trader smiled as the competition grew more intense. But behind the excitement of the bidders stood a much darker reality. For the woman on the platform, the attention of wealthy buyers did not mean freedom or opportunity. It meant uncertainty. Some plantation owners purchased women to work in houses as servants. Others intended to place them in the fields. In the worst cases, beauty in the slave market made women targets for exploitation by the very men bidding for them. The crowd continued raising the price. Eventually, two wealthy buyers remained locked in a quiet battle, each raising the offer slightly higher than the other. The rest of the market watched in silence. Finally, one of the men stepped back and lowered his hand. The bidding ended. The highest offer belonged to a plantation owner from the Louisiana sugar region. The trader struck his gavel against the wooden table. Sold. The moment passed quickly. Within minutes, the market returned to its usual noise as the next group of enslaved people were brought forward. But those who witnessed the sale later remembered the strange silence that had filled the auction yard when the woman first stepped onto the platform. Some observers wrote about it years later, describing how even hardened traders and buyers had been momentarily stunned. Yet their accounts also remind us of something deeper about that moment. In the brutal system of slavery, even beauty could become another reason for someone to lose control over their own life. The rare account from Louisiana in 1851 survives today as a reminder of how complex and painful the stories of the slave markets truly were. Behind every auction price and every transaction stood real human lives whose futures were decided in moments like the one described that morning. And it is exactly these forgotten stories that we continue uncovering here on Shadow of Black History, where the voices and experiences of people nearly erased from history are brought back into the light. Because sometimes a single moment in the past can reveal an entire world that history tried to forget. The plantation owner who had won the bidding stepped forward while the trader recorded the sale in a small leather book. In the slave markets of Louisiana, the transaction rarely took long. Once the gavel struck the table and the price was confirmed, the person sold would be removed from the platform and taken to join the other purchasers waiting to be transported. The woman remained standing calmly as the trader counted the payment. Observers later described her composure as unusual. Many people placed on the auction block showed visible fear or distress. Yet this woman stood with quiet dignity, her eyes moving slowly across the yard as if she were memorizing the faces around her. The buyer approached the platform. He was a plantation owner from the sugar-producing regions south of New Orleans, where the work in the fields was considered some of the hardest labor in the South. Sugar plantations demanded intense physical effort, especially during the grinding season when workers labored day and night processing the harvested cane. The man studied her carefully before signaling for the guards to bring her down from the platform. The crowd that had gathered slowly began returning to its usual noise. Traders called for the next sale, and buyers moved back toward the benches where the remaining enslaved people waited their turn. But several men continued glancing towards the woman as she was led away. Moments earlier, she had been the center of attention. Now, she was simply another purchase being escorted toward a waiting wagon. The plantation owner spoke briefly with the trader while the guards prepared the transport. Records from the time show that newly purchased enslaved people were often moved quickly from the market to prevent escape attempts or disruptions in the crowded auction yards. Within minutes, the wagon carrying the new purchases rolled away from the marketplace and toward the docks along the Mississippi River. From there, many buyers arranged transport by boat to reach plantations scattered across the Louisiana countryside. The journey south from New Orleans could take hours or even days depending on the distance of the plantation. During that journey, the woman who had stunned the auction yard would have had little control over where her life was heading next. Accounts written years later by people familiar with the Louisiana markets often described how beauty sometimes changed the type of work women were assigned after purchase. Some plantation owners placed such women in household positions where they worked as servants, cooks, or caregivers for the planter's family. Yet those same accounts also reveal the dangers such attention could bring. Women purchased because of their appearance often faced greater risks of exploitation within the plantation system. Without legal protection or personal freedom, their lives depended entirely on the decisions of those who claimed ownership over them. The rare description of the woman from the 1851 auction survives today, mainly through writings from observers who had witnessed the unusual moment when the entire market grew silent. For a brief instant, the cruelty of the slave market had been interrupted by something unexpected: human presence, grace, dignity. Even in a place designed to treat people as property, the crowd had recognized something remarkable about the woman standing before them. But the silence did not last. The auction resumed. The market continued. And the woman was carried away toward a future no one in that crowd could fully see. Historians who study these rare accounts often emphasize how important such moments are for understanding the deeper human realities behind slavery. Official records usually focused only on prices, transactions, and plantation operations. Rarely did they describe the individuals whose lives were being sold. Yet occasionally a small detail appears in the historical record that reminds us these were real people with stories, identities, and experiences far beyond the brief moments recorded in auction documents. The woman who stunned the Louisiana auction in 1851 may not have left behind written words of her own, but the reaction she caused that morning tells us something powerful. Even in the harshest system of control, humanity could still shine through in ways that forced people to pause and look more closely. And it is these rare glimpses into the lives of those who endured such moments that help us better understand the past. Stories like this one continue to be uncovered and shared here on Shadow of Black History, where forgotten lives and hidden moments are brought back into the light so that the voices history nearly erased are never completely lost. The wagon carrying the newly purchased people rolled slowly through the narrow streets of New Orleans towards the Mississippi River docks. Iron chains rattled softly with every turn of the wheels, and the wooden boards creaked under the weight of those sitting inside. The woman who had stunned the auction yard sat quietly among the others, her hands resting in her lap as the city moved around them. The streets were busy that morning. Merchants shouted from storefronts, sailors hauled cargo toward waiting ships, and carts filled with sugar and cotton rattled towards the riverfront. For the people watching from the sidewalks, the wagon was not unusual. Slave markets had become a common part of life in the city. Yet a few people who had witnessed the auction earlier whispered quietly as the wagon passed. "That is the woman from the market," one man murmured. "The one everyone stopped to look at." But the wagon did not stop. It continued towards the docks, where the Mississippi River flowed wide and brown beneath the rising heat of the Louisiana sun. The plantation owner walked beside the wagon for part of the journey, before stepping ahead to speak with a riverboat captain. The purchase had already been arranged to travel south by boat. Many plantations were located along the river, and transporting newly purchased workers by water was faster than moving them by road. Soon the group was guided onto a flat transport boat tied to the dock. The river moved quietly beneath them as the captain gave orders to untie the ropes. Within minutes, the boat pushed away from the busy harbor and began drifting south along the Mississippi. Behind them, the city slowly faded. The markets, the crowds, the auction yard, where the woman had stood beneath dozens of staring eyes. All of it disappeared as the boat moved deeper into the river. For the passengers on board, the journey ahead was uncertain. Some would be taken to cotton plantations, where long days in the fields awaited them. Others might work in houses, kitchens, or workshops, depending on the needs of the plantation owners who had purchased them. The woman remained quiet throughout the journey. Observers who later wrote about similar trips described how many enslaved people spent these river journeys in silence, reflecting on the sudden change in their lives. Some had been separated from family members only hours earlier. Others were traveling hundreds of miles away from the places they once knew. As the boat continued south, the land along the river changed gradually. The crowded city gave way to stretches of farmland and thick forests. Plantation houses occasionally appeared along the riverbanks, their large columns rising above the surrounding fields. By late afternoon, the boat approached one of the sugar plantations belonging to the buyer who had won the auction. Workers were already visible in the fields near the river. The tall stalks of sugarcane moved gently in the breeze, while overseers watched from horseback along the edges of the fields. The boat slowed as it approached the wooden landing. When the passengers stepped onto the dock, their new lives began immediately. Orders were given. Groups were divided. Names were written into plantation records. The woman who had stunned the auction crowd was led towards the large plantation house rather than the fields. The buyer had decided she would work inside the household rather than among the laborers cutting cane. Even so, her life would still be controlled by the system that governed the plantation. Days would be filled with chores. Nights would bring little rest, and her future would remain uncertain under the authority of those who claimed ownership over her life. Yet the moment in the auction yard continued to be remembered by some who had witnessed it. Years later, a visitor to the Louisiana markets recorded the strange silence that had fallen over the crowd when the woman first appeared on the platform. In his account, he wrote that even the traders, men accustomed to the harsh business of selling human lives, had paused in surprise. For just a few seconds, the routine cruelty of the market had been interrupted, not by protest, not by rebellion, but simply by the undeniable presence of a human being whose dignity could not be completely hidden, even in the harshest of circumstances. That brief silence in the auction yard became the reason historians remember the story today. Because sometimes the smallest moment in the historical record reveals something powerful about the people whose voices were rarely written down. The woman who stunned the Louisiana auction in the year 1851 may never have known that her presence left such an impression on those who saw her. But the memory of that moment survived. And through stories like this, we are reminded that behind every transaction recorded in the slave markets were real lives real emotions, and real human strength that no system of oppression could fully erase. That is why we continue uncovering stories like this here on Shadow of Black History, where forgotten lives and hidden moments from the past are brought back into the light so that history is remembered not only through records, but through the humanity of the people who lived it. The plantation where the woman arrived lay deep in the Louisiana sugar country, a region known for some of the most demanding labor in the American South. Sugarcane required constant attention from planting through harvest, and during the grinding season workers sometimes labored through the night processing cane in large mills beside the fields. But the woman who had stunned the auction yard was not sent into those fields. The plantation owner had already decided she would work inside the household. When she stepped onto the dock, one of the house servants was called forward and instructed to lead her towards the large white plantation house that stood beyond the rows of cane. The building rose above the fields with wide columns and shaded balconies designed to catch the breeze from the river. From the outside it appeared peaceful and grand, yet for the people who worked there, it was simply another place where their lives were controlled by the orders of others. Inside the house, the woman was introduced to the head house servant, an older woman who had worked on the plantation for many years. The older woman studied her quietly for a moment before giving her the first instructions. "You will help in the kitchen and the laundry," she said calmly. "When guests visit, you will assist in serving meals." The routine of plantation life began immediately. Days started before sunrise. Fires were lit in the kitchen while the first light of morning appeared over the fields. Meals were prepared for the household. Laundry was washed in large iron kettles, and floors were swept long before the plantation owner and his family came downstairs. From the windows of the house, the woman could see the sugarcane fields stretching across the land. Workers moved slowly through the rows beneath the watch of overseers on horseback. Life inside the house was different from the fields, but it still followed the strict order of plantation life. And yet something about the woman continued to attract attention. Visitors who came to the plantation noticed her immediately. Some remembered hearing about the unusual auction in New Orleans, where the market had fallen silent when she stepped onto the platform. Others simply observed the quiet dignity she carried, even while performing the exhausting work required of her. One visitor later wrote in a travel journal about the strange impression she left on those who saw her. He described how the household staff moved quickly through their duties, but this woman seemed to carry herself with a calm strength that was difficult to ignore. She spoke little. She worked hard. Yet her presence seemed to remind observers that the people working inside the plantation were far more than the roles assigned to them. Years passed, and the plantation continued its routine of planting, harvesting, and shipping sugar along the Mississippi River. The woman's life remained tied to the rhythms of the house and the demands of those who owned the land. But the brief moment in the New Orleans auction yard continued to live on in small pieces of written memory. Travelers who passed through the city sometimes repeated the story of the day when a crowd of traders and buyers had unexpectedly fallen silent during a sale. It was not a protest or an argument that caused the pause. It was simply the presence of a woman whose dignity had momentarily interrupted the harsh routine of the slave market. Historians who study these rare accounts often note that moments like this offer small glimpses into the humanity of people whose lives were rarely recorded in detail. Most plantation records listed only names, ages, and prices. But occasionally a description survives that reminds us these were individuals with personalities, strength, and presence that could not be reduced to numbers in a ledger. The woman who stunned the Louisiana auction in the year 1851 remains largely anonymous in the historical record. Her name was not preserved in the accounts that described that moment, yet the memory of her presence remained strong enough for observers to record the unusual silence that filled the market that day. And through that memory, we are reminded that even in systems built to strip people of their identity, the human spirit could still shine through in ways that forced others to pause and notice. It is stories like this that continue to be explored and remembered here on Shadow of Black History, where forgotten lives and overlooked moments from the past are brought back into the light. Because history is not only the story of powerful leaders and major events. It is also the story of individuals whose strength, dignity, and humanity left impressions that time could not erase. As the years passed, the plantation continued its steady rhythm of planting, harvesting, and shipping sugar along the Mississippi River. Seasons came and went, and life on the estate rarely changed. The workers in the fields labored under the sun, while the house servants maintained the endless tasks inside the large plantation home. The woman who had once stunned the auction crowd became part of that routine. She worked in the kitchen, the laundry, and sometimes in the dining room when visitors arrived. Those who worked beside her noticed that she rarely complained, even during the longest days. Her movements were calm and deliberate, and she carried herself with a quiet confidence that others found difficult to explain. New servants occasionally arrived at the plantation, brought from other markets along the river. Some of them had heard stories about the New Orleans auction, where the crowd had fallen silent at the sight of a young woman on the platform. At first, they did not realize that the same woman was now working beside them in the house. But over time, the story spread quietly through the plantation quarters. People whispered about the day when even hardened slave traders had paused their shouting and bidding. They spoke about how the noise of the market had faded for a moment as everyone looked towards the platform. The story was repeated in quiet voices during the evenings after work. Not because the moment had changed the cruel system around them, but because it revealed something deeper. Even in a place designed to treat people as property, dignity could still be seen. And sometimes that dignity was powerful enough to make others pause, even if only briefly. Years later, visitors traveling through Louisiana occasionally wrote about life on the sugar plantations. In one of those travel journals, the writer mentioned hearing about the unusual auction that had taken place in New Orleans many years earlier. The writer described how people in the region still remembered the strange silence that had filled the market that day. He noted that the event had become something of a quiet legend among those who had witnessed it, a moment when the usual noise of bargaining and shouting had stopped, a moment when people had looked at the person on the platform not only as property, but as a human being. The writer never recorded the woman's name. Many records from that time failed to preserve such details, especially for enslaved people whose lives were rarely documented beyond sales and plantation inventories. Yet the memory of that moment remained strong enough for the story to survive. It continued to be passed along through conversations, journals, and later historical studies that searched for the human experiences hidden inside the records of slavery. Today, historians often examine these rare descriptions carefully, because moments like the one described in the Louisiana auction of 1851 reveal something important about history. They show that even within systems built on cruelty and control, people could not completely erase the humanity of those they tried to own. Sometimes it appeared through courage, sometimes through resistance, and sometimes simply through presence. The woman who stunned the Louisiana auction may not have left behind written words of her own, but the reaction she caused that day tells us something powerful. Her dignity forced a crowd of traders and buyers to pause, even if only for a moment. And through that moment, her story continues to remind us that the lives behind the records of slavery were far richer, stronger, and more complex than the documents of the time ever revealed. That is why stories like this continue to be explored and shared here on Shadow of Black History, where forgotten lives and hidden moments from the past are brought back into the light. Because every story we recover helps us remember that history is not only about events. It is about people. Over time, the plantation where the woman lived continued to operate much like countless others across Louisiana. The sugar harvests rose and fell with the seasons. Riverboats carried shipments north and south along the Mississippi, and new workers were occasionally brought in from the markets to replace those who had grown older or too weak for the demanding labor. Inside the plantation house, the routines remained strict and predictable. Meals had to be prepared before the family woke, clothing washed and pressed, floors swept, and visitors attended to whenever guests arrived from nearby estates. The woman who had once stood beneath the gaze of an entire auction crowd carried out these tasks day after day. But those who worked with her often noticed something unusual. Even in a place where most people moved quickly and quietly to avoid punishment, she seemed to carry herself with an unusual calm. Younger servants sometimes looked to her for guidance when learning new tasks, and older workers occasionally asked her advice when tensions grew within the household. Without official authority, she had become a quiet source of stability among those who shared the same difficult life. Stories about the auction in New Orleans continued circulating quietly among the enslaved community. Some workers who had once lived near the city remembered hearing about the unusual sale years earlier. They described how the market had gone silent when the woman stepped onto the platform. When new arrivals came to the plantation, they sometimes repeated the story again. Over time, the event became something more than just a memory of the auction yard. It became a reminder that even in a place designed to reduce people to numbers and prices, there were moments when humanity forced its way through the cruelty of the system. The plantation owner himself rarely mentioned the event. To him, the sale had simply been another purchase recorded in a ledger. Yet visitors who stayed at the plantation occasionally noticed the same thing others had seen before. There was something about the woman's presence that commanded attention, not through loud words, not through open defiance, but through a quiet dignity that was difficult to ignore. Some guests later wrote about their visits to Louisiana plantations in travel journals and letters. In one such account, a visitor mentioned meeting a house servant whose presence reminded him of a story he had heard years earlier about a remarkable auction in New Orleans. The writer admitted that he could not confirm whether the story was true, but he described the woman as someone whose calm confidence left a lasting impression on everyone she encountered. Moments like that are rare in historical records. Most documents from the slavery era focus on economic details such as crop yields, trade routes, and plantation accounts. The personal experiences of enslaved individuals were rarely written down in detail. But occasionally a fragment survives. A journal entry, a letter, a brief observation recorded by someone who witnessed something unusual. And through these fragments, historians are able to piece together glimpses of the lives behind the numbers. The story of the woman who stunned the Louisiana auction in the year 1851 is one of those fragments. A brief moment when the loud, harsh routine of a slave market was interrupted by something powerful enough to silence an entire crowd. Not rebellion, not violence, simply the undeniable presence of a human being whose dignity could not be completely hidden, even in the most oppressive place imaginable. Today, stories like this help remind us that history is not only about systems and institutions. It is about individuals, people whose lives carried strength, resilience, and humanity, even when the world around them tried to erase those qualities. The woman whose beauty stunned the Louisiana auction may remain unnamed in the records of the time, but the moment she created continues to echo across history. And that is why stories like this continue to be uncovered and shared here on Shadow of Black History, where forgotten lives and overlooked moments from the past are brought back into the light. Because sometimes a single moment, preserved in the memory of those who witnessed it, can reveal more about the past than entire pages of official records ever could. As the years moved forward, the story of the silent auction in New Orleans slowly became part of the quiet folklore of the region. It was not recorded in official plantation ledgers, and it did not appear in the bold headlines of newspapers. Instead, it survived in something far more fragile and human: memory. Travelers who passed through Louisiana sometimes repeated the story during conversations in river towns. Former market workers mentioned it when discussing unusual sales they had witnessed. Even a few traders who had been present that morning occasionally recalled the strange moment when the noise of the auction yard suddenly faded. Many of them described the same thing. For just a few seconds, the entire crowd had stopped. No shouting, no arguing over prices, no loud competition between buyers, only silence as people stared towards the platform. The reason for that silence was not rebellion or protest. The system of slavery continued exactly as it had before and after that moment. But what those witnesses remembered was the powerful reminder that even in a place designed to treat people as property, humanity could still reveal itself in unexpected ways. Back on the plantation, life continued under the rigid structure of daily labor. The woman who had once stood on the auction platform carried out her duties inside the large house, moving through kitchens, hallways, and dining rooms where the lives of plantation families unfolded. New generations of children were born on the estate. Some grew up hearing whispers about the day their mother or grandmother had once stood before a crowd that fell silent. Those stories were not told loudly. They were shared quietly, often during the evening hours when work had ended and people gathered together for brief moments of rest. In those conversations, the story gained a different meaning. It was no longer just a strange moment in a marketplace. It became a reminder that dignity could exist even in the harshest conditions. The people telling the story understood that the woman's beauty had caught the attention of the buyers. But what truly stunned the crowd that day was something deeper. It was the calm strength in the way she stood before them, the way she refused to appear broken even while being treated as property, and the way that quiet strength forced everyone around her to pause. Years later, historians studying the era of slavery began searching through letters, journals, and personal writings left behind by travelers and merchants who had visited Louisiana during the 1800s. Among those writings, they found brief references to the unusual auction of 1851. The descriptions were short. A sentence here, a paragraph there. But they all mentioned the same remarkable detail. The market had fallen silent. Those small fragments became important clues for historians trying to understand the lived experiences of enslaved people during that period. Because official records rarely captured moments of emotion or human reaction. Yet those moments often revealed the deeper truths hidden behind the economic system of slavery. The story of the woman who stunned the Louisiana auction survives today because someone thought that moment of silence was worth writing down. because someone recognized that what happened in that crowded marketplace was unusual enough to remember, and because the memory of that moment continued to travel through time. Today, when historians revisit such accounts, they see more than just a description of beauty. They see a reminder that the people whose lives were controlled by the slave markets still possessed something that could not be fully taken from them: presence, strength, dignity. Even in the harshest systems of oppression, those qualities sometimes emerged in ways that forced the world around them to notice. That is why stories like this continue to matter, because they remind us that history is not only about the systems that controlled people. It is also about the individuals who lived within those systems and whose humanity refused to disappear. And it is exactly these kinds of forgotten moments that we continue exploring here on Shadow of Black History, where hidden voices and overlooked lives from the past are brought back into the light. Because sometimes the smallest moment preserved in history carries the greatest meaning. As time moved forward, the plantation continued its quiet cycle of seasons along the Mississippi River. Sugarcane fields rose tall in the summer heat and were cut down during the grinding months when smoke from the mills drifted across the sky. Riverboats passed constantly along the water, carrying cargo, travelers, and sometimes new groups of enslaved people from distant markets. Life inside the plantation house followed the same pattern year after year. Meals were prepared before sunrise. Floors were cleaned, laundry washed, and guests served when neighboring plantation families visited. The woman who had once stood before a stunned crowd in the New Orleans auction yard continued performing her duties with the same calm composure that had first caught people's attention. Many who worked beside her came to respect her deeply. Some described her as quiet but observant. Others noticed how younger servants often turned to her for advice when learning the difficult routines of housework. Even without authority, she had become someone others trusted. Her presence had a steadying effect inside the household. The story of the silent auction continued traveling through whispered conversations among enslaved communities across the region. Workers who had once lived near New Orleans occasionally mentioned hearing about it. New arrivals brought stories from other plantations where the event had been repeated as a curious memory from the past. In those quiet retellings, the moment began taking on a different meaning. The people who told the story were not focused only on the woman's beauty. They remembered the silence. They remembered how even the traders and buyers, men who spent their lives negotiating the prices of human beings, had paused when she stepped onto the platform. That pause mattered, because in a place designed to remove identity and dignity from those being sold, something about her presence had forced the crowd to see her as more than just property. For just a few seconds, the entire system had hesitated. The woman herself never wrote about that moment. Like most enslaved people of the time, she was denied the opportunity to record her own experiences. The details of her life were left mostly in the memories of others. But sometimes history survives in unexpected ways. A traveler's journal, a merchant's letter, a brief description written by someone who witnessed something unusual. These fragments allow historians to reconstruct glimpses of lives that official records ignored. The rare account of the Louisiana auction in the year 1851 is one of those fragments. It reminds us that behind every price listed in a slave market ledger stood a real human being whose presence could still leave a lasting impression on those who saw them. Even in places built on cruelty and control, humanity could not be completely erased. And sometimes that humanity revealed itself in the quietest ways. A calm posture, a steady gaze, a dignity that refused to disappear even in the most oppressive circumstances. That is why the story of the woman who stunned the Louisiana auction continues to be remembered today. Not simply because of her beauty, but because of the moment when an entire crowd was forced to pause and look more closely at the person standing before them. A moment that reminds us that history is filled with individuals whose strength and humanity could not be fully captured in the records left behind. And it is exactly these forgotten moments that we continue uncovering here on Shadow of Black History, where hidden stories and overlooked lives from the past are brought back into the light. Because sometimes a single moment of silence in history can speak louder than anything written in the records of the time. As the decades slowly passed, the plantation where the woman lived witnessed many changes along the Mississippi River. New generations of workers were brought to the estate, crops rose and fell with the seasons, and the world beyond the plantation gradually shifted as tensions across the United States grew stronger during the middle of the 19th century. Yet within the quiet spaces of the plantation quarters, stories continued to live on. Among those stories was the memory of the unusual auction in New Orleans. Older workers who had once heard about it from others repeated the story to younger listeners during the evenings when the day's labor was finally finished. They described the crowded auction yard, the loud traders calling for bids, and the moment when the entire place suddenly grew quiet. Some said the silence lasted only a few seconds. Others remembered it as longer. But everyone agreed on one thing. The people in that market had stopped shouting and bargaining because something about the woman on the platform forced them to see her differently. The story became more than just a memory of a sale. It became a quiet symbol, a reminder that even within a brutal system designed to reduce people to property, the humanity of those being sold could still break through in unexpected ways. Years later, historians examining the records of the Louisiana slave markets searched through letters, journals, and travel writings left behind by visitors to the region. Among those documents, they discovered brief references to the strange moment in the auction yard during the year 1851. The descriptions were not long. Most writers mentioned the event only briefly before continuing their accounts of life in the city. But those few sentences were enough to preserve the memory. They described a young woman whose presence had stunned the crowd. They described traders pausing in their shouting. And they described a rare moment of silence in a place normally filled with harsh bargaining and noise. For historians, those small details carried powerful meaning. Because the official records of slavery rarely captured moments of emotion or human reaction. They focused mainly on numbers, prices, and transactions. But these fragments revealed something deeper. They showed that the people being sold were never truly invisible. Even when systems attempted to erase their identity, moments still occurred when their presence forced others to acknowledge their humanity. The woman whose beauty stunned the Louisiana auction remains largely unnamed in the historical record. Her personal story was never fully written down. Yet the moment she created survived long enough to become part of the historical memory of the region. And through that moment, we gain a glimpse into the deeper human experiences hidden within the records of the slave markets. Today, when historians and storytellers revisit such accounts, they are reminded that history is not only made of grand events and famous names. It is also shaped by individuals whose quiet strength left impressions that time could not completely erase. The woman who stood on that platform in 1851 may never have known that her presence would be remembered more than a century later. But the silence she created in that crowded marketplace continues to echo through the pages of history. And that is exactly why stories like this are shared here on Shadow of Black History, where forgotten voices and hidden moments from the past are brought back into the light. Because sometimes the smallest detail preserved in history can remind us of the humanity that existed even in the darkest chapters of the past. As time continued to move forward, the world around the Mississippi River slowly began to change. The middle years of the 19th century brought growing tensions across the United States as debates about slavery, freedom, and the future of the nation intensified. Newspapers carried more frequent discussions about the institution of slavery, and travelers moving along the river often spoke about the uncertainty that seemed to be spreading through the country. But on plantations like the one where the woman lived, daily life remained tightly controlled. The rhythms of work continued almost unchanged. Fields were planted and harvested. Ships carried crops down the river, and the routines inside the plantation house followed the same strict order every day. The woman who had once stood on the auction platform remained part of that routine. Yet within the quiet corners of the plantation community, the story of the silent auction was still remembered. People who worked beside her often spoke about how the event had become a symbol of something larger than the sale itself. To them, the moment represented a rare instance when the system had briefly paused, even if only for a few seconds. The silence in that crowded market had revealed something that could not easily be measured in money or recorded in a ledger. It revealed dignity, and that dignity continued to shape how people remembered her. Younger servants who grew up hearing the story sometimes watched her carefully as she worked in the house. They noticed the calm way she moved through her duties, the steady tone in her voice when speaking to others, and the quiet strength she carried even during the hardest days. For them, the story of the auction was not only about beauty. It was about resilience. It was about the ability to hold on to one's humanity in a system that tried to take it away. Years later, as historians began studying personal accounts from the era more closely, the brief references to the Louisiana auction of 1851 gained new attention. Scholars realized that these small descriptions provided rare insight into how enslaved individuals were sometimes perceived by those around them. While the system itself remained cruel and oppressive, moments like the silent auction revealed that the humanity of those being sold could still break through the harsh structure of the market. These fragments of memory became important for understanding the lived experiences behind the economic records of slavery. They showed that enslaved people were not simply figures in account books. They were individuals whose presence, strength, and dignity could leave lasting impressions on those who encountered them. The woman who stunned the Louisiana auction may never have had the chance to record her own story. But the moment she created that morning in New Orleans survived through the memories of those who witnessed it. And through those memories, her presence continues to remind us that even in the darkest chapters of history, the human spirit could still command attention. Today, the story stands as a small but powerful example of how individual lives shaped the history of the time. It reminds us that behind every record, every price, and every transaction were real people whose experiences carried meaning far beyond the pages where they were recorded. That is why stories like this continue to be shared here on Shadow of Black History, where forgotten lives and overlooked moments from the past are brought back into the light. Because sometimes the quietest moment in history can reveal the strongest voice.
Before Josiah could say another word, Kofi began moving down the slope. He did not try to hide his tracks this time. Instead, he stepped heavily through the mud, making sure the patrol could easily follow his path. Within minutes, the riders reached the place where he had climbed from the river. One of the men pointed deeper into the forest, where Kofi's fresh footprints led away. "There he is," the man shouted. The patrol mounted their horses again and began riding quickly along the trail Kofi had left. From the ridge, Josiah watched the giant disappear deeper into the forest. The riders followed only seconds behind. Branches snapped as the horses pushed through the undergrowth, chasing the massive figure moving ahead of them. Kofi ran through the trees with powerful strides. Even without chains, his steps shook the forest floor as he moved. The riders shouted behind him, urging their horses forward. But the forest was thick, and Kofi knew something the patrol did not. He was not running blindly. He was running toward the swamp. Within minutes, the ground began turning softer beneath his feet. Water pooled between the trees, and the path narrowed into thick marshland, where horses could not move easily. Behind him, the riders slowed. The swamp swallowed the trail. Horses struggled to move through the muddy water. Kofi continued forward. Soon the trees closed around him, and the sounds of the patrol faded behind the thick walls of swamp and forest. Back on the ridge, Josiah finally allowed himself to breathe again. The riders had taken the bait. Freedom Hollow remained hidden, and somewhere deep in the Mississippi swamp, the giant slave no master could transport had once again vanished into the wilderness. But now, the hunters knew something they had not known before. The man they were chasing was not just strong. He was clever, and the next time the patrol returned to the river looking for him, they would be entering a forest where Kofi now knew every path. The patrol searched the swamp for hours. Their horses struggled through the thick mud and shallow water, while the men shouted directions to one another. From time to time, they found broken branches or faint footprints where Kofi had passed. But the deeper they moved into the swamp, the more the trail disappeared. The Mississippi wilderness was not friendly to outsiders. Water covered the ground in many places, washing away tracks within minutes. Tall reeds and thick roots twisted covered the ground in many places, washing away tracks within minutes. Tall reeds and thick roots twisted across the land, creating paths that changed with every step. By midday, the riders were exhausted, their horses slowing beneath the heat and the weight of the journey. One of the men finally pulled his horse to a stop. "This is useless," he muttered. Another rider wiped sweat from his face and looked around at the endless swamp. That giant could be anywhere now. They searched for a while longer, but the forest refused to give them what they wanted. Eventually, the patrol turned their horses back toward the river. The man they had chased from Natchez had vanished completely, and they would never see him again. Deep within the forest, far beyond the reach of the riders, Kofi moved slowly through the swamp until the sounds of the patrol disappeared entirely. Only then did he stop. The giant stood quietly beside a cluster of trees, listening to the distant calls of birds and the quiet movement of water through the marsh. The danger had passed for now. When the sun began lowering toward the horizon, Kofi finally turned back toward the hidden paths that led to Freedom Hollow. The people in the camp were waiting. When he stepped into the clearing again, a cheer rose among them. Josiah rushed forward first, relief clear in his face. "You led them far away," Josiah said. Kofi nodded. "They will search other places now." Ruth smiled softly as she handed him a cup of water. "You protected this place," she said. Kofi looked around the camp. Children were laughing again near the fire. Families moved freely through the clearing without fear of chains or overseers. The hidden community had survived another day. For years, his strength had been used by others. In the slave markets, it had made him valuable. On plantations, it had made him a tool for labor. On the riverboat, it had made him a prisoner chained to iron. But here in Freedom Hollow, his strength had become something different. It had become protection. In the weeks that followed, Kofi helped the community grow stronger. He cleared new paths through the forest, helped build stronger shelters, and trained others how to move quietly through the swamp if patrols ever returned. Word slowly spread among escaped slaves traveling along the river. There was a place deep in the Mississippi wilderness where people lived free. A place protected by the forest and guarded by a giant man who had once terrified the slave markets of the South. No one could transport him. No master could control him. And no patrol ever managed to capture him again. Some travelers who passed along the Mississippi years later spoke quietly about a hidden settlement deep in the swamp. They said a towering man watched over the camp, a man who moved through the forest like a shadow and protected anyone who reached that place seeking freedom. Whether those stories were fully true or grew larger through time, one thing remained certain. The giant slave the traders once struggled to sell had become something they never expected. Not property, not cargo, but a guardian of freedom. And somewhere deep in the forests, along the Mississippi River, the legend of Kofi continued to grow long after the slave markets that once tried to own him had faded into history. That is the kind of forgotten story we uncover here on Shadow of Black History, where the voices and courage of those nearly erased from history are finally brought back into the light. Because sometimes the people history tried to silence become the very legends it can never forget.